Why did people think that this doctrine was so marvellous? I mean, why did this philosophy have the enormous impact that it did? Because it does seem to me to be a very strange one, and it does seem to me to leave an awful lot out. For example, I would have thought that the most expressive uses of language that there are those in creative art, in poetry, drama, novels, and so on, both the most sophisticated uses of language and the profoundest. And yet this theory of Wittgenstein simply seems to allow no place for an explanation of these uses of language at all. It seems very limited, very partial. Would you accept that criticism of it?
Yes. It is limited, but I think if called upon to defend it, he would perhaps say that all other uses of language, insofar as they can be taken seriously and aren't some form of wordplay, require the explanation of this fundamental descriptive employment, world-describing employment of language first of all. But about why people thought it was important, you mentioned as an argument against its being important that it was strange. But I should have thought part of the fascination just was that it was so strange. It's not, one might say, a terribly modestly expressed book. In the preface he says, I am convinced that the final solution to all philosophical problems is contained here. And of course, quite compatibly with that, he there and then gave up philosophy once, for a considerable period, 10 years or so, once he'd completed the Tractatus. So its strangeness is part of its appeal. But it's not only that, its literary quality is rather striking. It's like a voice speaking out of a whirlwind. These short, pregnant, aphoristic sentences. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one, the world is everything that is the case. It's one of those baffling announcements that one doesn't quite know what to make of. The last one, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. One first sight, that looks like a truism, and then one realizes it isn't quite a truism. He says it's the essential message of the whole book, is to draw the limits of what can intelligibly be said.
I suppose the first thing that strikes anyone about the book when they pick it up for the first time is the way it's written, because it's written not in continuous prose at all, but in very brief paragraphs, numbered according to a very elaborate system of subdivisions and sub-subdivisions and even sub-sub-subdivisions. And some of these paragraphs are only one sentence long. And as you've just indicated in what you said, the connections between them aren't always very obvious, nor is their meaning in itself very obvious either. Why did he write in this enigmatic, almost hermetic way?
Well, he was an immensely fastidious man in all respects, I presume, but certainly there's evidence for any reader of what one might call his intellectual fastidiousness. He detested what I suppose one will have to call bourgeois academic philosophy, the idea of philosophy as a trade, a 9-to-5 occupation, which you do with a part of yourself and then you go off and lead the rest of your life in independence of it. He was a man of the utmost moral intensity, of extreme passionate seriousness. He took himself with very great seriousness. He took his own work with very great seriousness. When it wasn't going well, he got into a desperate and agonized condition. The result of this displays itself in his manner of is displayed in his manner of writing. That you feel that his whole idea of himself is behind everything that he says. Well, this also means that he rather tends to disregard or to despise philosophy produced in a more easygoing, relaxed, businesslike, vocational manner, that he wishes to distance himself from that altogether, and he doesn't want to make the thing too easy. He doesn't want to express himself in a way that people can pick up by simply running their eyes over the pages. This is an instrument for changing the whole intellectual aspect of its readers' lives. And so the way to it is made difficult. I think that could be a justification relative to his intentions of his way of proceeding.
I must say the prose does seem to me to have extraordinary quality. I find the sentences supercharged. They have this haunting capacity to stay in the mind, and one finds oneself quoting them very easily after one's read the book. I would regard Wittgenstein as one of those few philosophers like Plato or Schopenhauer or Nietzsche who are also great literary artists, great writers. Would you agree with that?
I think he is. He's certainly a very conscious artist. He was a distinguished mind, a cultivated man. He didn't make a mess of it, therefore. There's nothing, you couldn't say of his work that it was ever pretentious. It pretends to great things. It makes claims of itself. But it seems to me the literary garment of his thought is worthy of the seriousness with which he presented those thoughts.
I think we must go back a bit now to what some of the doctrines were. We talked about this central notion of language picturing the world, and you explained how he distinguished between true utterances and false utterances. Does he provide us with any way of seeing if a statement pictures the world, of seeing if our utterances are true or false? What kind of analysis of the utterance will show us whether it's true or false?
There's absolutely no explanation, as I said earlier, of what the simple objects are, and therefore there's no account given of, so to speak, how we come to be aware of the simple objects. All he talks about is what the relation between the basic propositions of discourse and the objects to which they relate must be. What he does do is suggest various ways in which the sentences of ordinary discourse can be analysed or decomposed into these ultimate, basically pictorial sentences. His theory is that every genuine proposition that isn't itself one of these ultimate sentences, and he doesn't give any examples of actual everyday propositions that are, every such proposition must be decomposable into them. And his thesis is, to put it in a slightly technical way, that every genuine proposition whatever is a truth function of elementary propositions, which in effect means that it's just an abbreviated formula for a vast assemblage, a conjunction of elementary propositions and the negations thereof.
Well, I think before we move away from the Tractatus and its doctrines, which Wittgenstein himself did because he came to think that they were unsatisfactory, it would probably be helpful if you would summarize, if you now could, what the central doctrines of that book are.
Well, the central doctrine, I think, is that language in its fundamentally distinctive use as a means for describing the world can work only by picturing the world. How it pictures the world is through configuring names of objects, names of simple objects, into arrangements that correspond, where the proposition is true, to an actual arrangement of objects, which correspond, where the proposition is false, to a possible arrangement of objects. From this, of course, it follows that the world is an array of some sort of simple objects, exhibiting one of the possibilities of combination that are open to them. Connected with this is the view that, although many genuine propositions we utter don't seem to be of this form, they can be dismantled, analysed into propositions of this form. There is one thing we haven't talked about, which is of very great influence, his view of the nature of logic and mathematics. He insisted that the propositions of logic and mathematics don't describe the world. They're, so to speak, a byproduct of the abbreviated nature of actual language. What a logical truth does is state what should be evident, namely that one proposition contains within itself another proposition. That is, some complex of pictures of the elementary pictures of the world contains in its content certain other. But some of them.
So in other words, according to that theory, all the truths of mathematics, like all the truths of logic, are tautologies.
Are tautologies.
Just unpacking what is already there in the proposition.
Yes, that they give no information about the world itself. They're simply symbolic in character, as it were. They talk about the relation of symbolism. And again, he said that these propositions were senseless in that they had no factual content. They didn't tell us anything about how things were when how things were was different from how they might have been. They simply reflect the character of the language we use.
Now, what was the influence of this early philosophy of Wittgenstein? It was, in fact, very great, wasn't it?
Very considerable, but it was exercised through only a small part of the work he produced. The greater part of the Tractatus is concerned with this theory of propositions as pictures, words as names, the things propositions related to as configurations of simple objects or facts. That's the great bulk of the book, the first, say, 2/3 of it or something like that. And in that form, I think it's fair to say that nobody took it up at all. People were baffled and astounded and puzzled by it. But the group of philosophers who claimed to derive their main inspiration from Wittgenstein, namely the positivists of the Vienna Circle, although they accepted the view that there must be some basic propositions which relate, as it were, directly to the world, there must be a point in language where direct contact with the world is made, they gave a much more straightforward and easily intelligible account of this relation. In essence, it was that these elementary propositions simply describe the sense experiences of individual observers. So they report immediate occurrences of experience, feeling, perceptions by individual persons, and then that everything else could be, all the other beliefs we held could be analysed out into propositions of this kind, propositions about continuing material objects that exist unperceived, propositions about minds other than our own, propositions about social institutions, that all of these could be analysed in the end down to simple reports of private experience.